my God.
I overheard my own daughter hand her mother-in-law my debit card. "Take it," she said. "Mom won't even miss it." I stood frozen in that hallway for a long moment, and by the time I stepped away, I already knew exactly what I was going to do about it. This is a true life story, and by the end of it, I promise you, you won't believe how far one family went to rebuild what almost broke them for good. I was 70 years old the year I finally understood what my daughter really thought of me. My husband Robert had been gone 2 years by then. Congestive heart failure, the slow kind, the kind that gives you just enough hope between the bad stretches to keep believing there might be more time. There wasn't. One winter he was still fixing the porch railing himself, refusing my help, and the next winter I was alone in a house built for 2 people, listening to the furnace click on in an empty hallway. I'd worked 44 years by the time I retired, first as a school secretary, then, after Robert's back gave out, running the front office at his auto shop for the last 15 of those years. Between the two of us, we built something modest but solid. A duplex on Ash Street that we'd bought the year Rachel started kindergarten, half of it rented out for years to a quiet retired couple who eventually became more like family than tenants. A little cabin up near the lake that we'd bought used and fixed up ourselves over 3 summers. Nothing extravagant, but ours, earned in small increments over decades most people don't have the patience for anymore. After Robert passed, I sold the cabin first. It felt like the easier of the two, a place we'd loved together, but that had never really been mine alone to keep. The duplex was harder. Then, this past spring, I finally let that go too. 61 years old when we bought it, 70 when I signed the closing papers, and in between it had held every holiday, every scraped knee, every Christmas morning my daughter could remember, plus decades of rent checks that had quietly padded our retirement without either of us ever calling it an investment out loud. The sale closed for $230,000, both units together. After paying off what was left on the mortgage and settling the closing costs, I walked away with just under $155,000. I split it deliberately. $85,000 went straight into a certificate of deposit at my credit union, locked away where I couldn't touch it without a penalty, which was exactly the point. The rest I kept in an everyday checking account, because my daughter Rachel convinced me I'd want quick access while I figured out my next chapter. She wasn't wrong about that part. I was still figuring things out. Rachel had spent the better part of a year trying to talk me into moving in with her and her husband. Their place had a converted in-law suite above the garage, its own entrance, a small kitchenette, plenty of privacy. She said it would be good for both of us. She said she didn't like the idea of me alone in that duplex once it sold, rattling around some apartment on my own. She said she wanted her boys to grow up close to their grandmother. All of that was true. It just wasn't the whole truth, though I didn't know that yet. Her husband's name was Mark. We'd always gotten along fine, in the surface way you get along with someone you see 4 times a year at holidays. He worked construction management, kept the garage spotless, ran his household on a tight schedule. Rachel adored him, and that was really all I needed to know for a long time. They had 2 boys, 10 and 7, and it was those 2 boys, more than anything else, who made me finally say yes to the move. I wanted to be close enough to walk them to school. I wanted mornings with them, not just birthdays and the occasional Sunday dinner. I should mention, too, that Rachel isn't my only child. I have a son, Kevin, 3 years older than her, who lives out in Colorado with his own family, a wife and a teenage daughter I see maybe twice a year if we're lucky. Kevin had offered, when Robert first got sick, to have me come live near him instead, out west, closer to mountains I'd always loved visiting but had never lived near. Part of me was tempted. Colorado meant distance from the duplex, from the memories soaked into every room of that place, from the particular grief of driving past Robert's old shop every time I ran an errand in town. But Kevin's life was already full in a way that made me hesitate. A demanding job, a daughter deep in the thick of high school, a household that didn't have the same natural space Rachel's did, no converted suite, no built-in role for me to step into gently rather than disruptively. And if I'm honest, there was something else too, something harder to admit. Kevin and I had always been close, but in the particular reserved way fathers and sons of Robert's generation modeled for their own sons, a closeness built more on shared projects than shared feelings. Rachel and I had always talked more easily, cried together more easily, and in the rawest months after Robert's death, it was Rachel's voice on the phone that got me through the worst nights. Not Kevin's, though he called plenty and meant every word of concern he offered. So when Rachel began her campaign to get me to move in, gentle and persistent in equal measure, it found softer ground with me than perhaps it otherwise would have. Kevin, when I told him I was considering it, was supportive but asked more questions than Rachel ever had about the practical arrangement. Whether I'd have my own space, my own say in household decisions, my own financial independence preserved within the arrangement. I remember telling him, a little defensively at the time, that Rachel had thought through all of it carefully, that this wasn't some impulsive invitation, but something she and Mark had discussed at length. I believed that fully when I said it. I still believe Rachel's initial intentions were good ones, even now, even knowing everything that came after. Kevin was, in fact, one of the first people I called after that evening in the hallway, before I'd even gathered the full statement from my credit union. I needed someone outside the situation entirely, someone who loved me without also needing to protect Rachel's feelings in the same conversation. He listened for a long time without saying much, which was very like him, and then asked the same kind of careful, practical questions he'd asked when I first considered the move. Had I confirmed the amounts? Did I know for certain it was ongoing rather than a single lapse in judgment? Was I safe, financially, regardless of how this resolved? His steadiness on that call anchored me during a week when I badly needed anchoring, and I've thanked him for it more than once since, though he always waves it off the way he waves off most things, in that quiet Colorado way he's adopted over the years. Kevin flew in, actually, about 3 weeks after I confronted Rachel, ostensibly for a visit he'd been planning anyway, though I suspect the timing wasn't entirely coincidental. He and Rachel had a long conversation of their own one evening, out on the back porch, that I wasn't part of and never asked about in detail. Whatever was said between them, Rachel mentioned afterward that it had been hard to hear, but that she was glad he'd said it, whatever it was. Siblings carry a particular authority with each other that even parents sometimes lack, a shared history of growing up in the same house, under the same rules, and I think Kevin's willingness to be direct with his sister, in his own careful way, mattered more to her long-term change than perhaps even my own words at that kitchen table had. I moved into that suite above the garage in early spring. For the first couple of months, it felt like exactly what I'd hoped for. I made pot roast on Sundays. I went to the boys' Little League games and sat in the same folding chair every time because the older one said it was good luck. I learned the family's rhythms, when Mark left for job sites before sunrise, when the boys needed their backpacks checked, when the house finally settled into quiet at night. I told myself, more than once that spring, that I had made the right decision. I still believe that, even now, even knowing everything I know. To understand why any of this hit me as hard as it did, you have to understand what those years with Robert actually looked like, underneath the surface most people saw. We married young, 22 and 24, in a small ceremony at his mother's church, because neither of our families had the money for anything grander. For the first 8 years, we rented a 2-bedroom unit above a hardware store, the same kind of business Robert would eventually come to run himself, though neither of us knew that yet. I worked the front desk at the elementary school down the road, answering phones, comforting skinned knees, learning every child's name in the building whether they were mine or not. Robert worked 2 jobs most of that decade, days at a warehouse and evenings doing small engine repair out of our garage for anyone willing to pay him in cash. We bought the duplex the year Rachel turned 5, and I still remember standing in the empty living room the day we closed, running my hand along a wall that needed paint, thinking that this was the first thing either of us had ever truly owned outright, or would, eventually, once the mortgage was paid down. We rented the other unit to a retired couple, the Hendersons, who stayed with us for 19 years and became something closer to family than tenants. The kind of people who watched Rachel when we couldn't afford a sitter and never once asked to be paid for it. Robert took over his father's auto shop when Rachel was 11, after his father's hands got too unsteady to work on engines safely anymore. Those early years running the shop were lean. We ate a lot of rice and beans that I dressed up different ways so it wouldn't feel like the same meal every night. There was a stretch, when Rachel was 12, when both our cars needed transmission work in the same month, and we genuinely didn't know if we'd make the mortgage payment. I took in tax preparation work on the side that winter, off the books, sitting at our kitchen table until midnight most nights doing other families' returns for cash, and neither Robert nor I ever told Rachel how close we'd come to losing the duplex that year. We made a decision, without ever really discussing it out loud, to shield her from that fear entirely, to let her childhood stay soft even when ours, for a stretch, had gone hard. I think about that decision often now, in light of everything that happened later, and I wonder sometimes if it was the right one. Rachel grew up believing, in some quiet, uncontested way, that money simply existed in our household, that it appeared when needed and covered what it needed to cover. She never saw the ledger books Robert kept in a metal box in his closet, never saw the years we skipped vacations so she could go to summer camp instead, never saw me turning down a winter coat for myself so there'd be enough for her school pictures. We wanted her to feel secure. I don't regret wanting that for her. But I do wonder, now, whether that security came at the cost of her ever truly understanding what security actually costs the people providing it. By the time Rachel left for state college, the shop was doing well enough that Robert could finally hire a second mechanic and take Sundays off for the first time in over a decade. We paid her tuition outright, no loans, a fact Robert took enormous quiet pride in. The kind of pride that showed itself in nothing louder than him sitting a little straighter at her graduation. She married Mark 6 years later, in a wedding we paid for almost entirely ourselves, at a venue Rachel picked because she'd always dreamed of getting married somewhere with a view of water. I remember standing at the edge of that reception, watching her dance with her father, thinking that whatever else happened in our lives, we had given our daughter exactly what we'd set out to give her. Robert's heart trouble started showing itself about 4 years after that wedding. Small warning signs at first, shortness of breath climbing the stairs, swelling in his ankles he blamed on standing too long at the shop. By the time the cardiologist gave us the full picture, congestive heart failure, stage 2 already, the damage had been building quietly for longer than either of us wanted to admit. We spent the next 2 years learning a new rhythm together, medication schedules, salt restrictions, hospital stays that got a little longer each time, good stretches that let us believe, briefly, that we'd found some kind of plateau, followed by bad stretches that reminded us there wasn't one. Rachel visited often during those 2 years, more often than I sometimes acknowledged to myself in the moment, and I don't want this story to suggest she wasn't a devoted daughter during her father's decline, because she absolutely was. She drove down every weekend she could manage. She sat with him during appointments I couldn't bear to sit through myself. Whatever came later, that part of her, the part that showed up for her father at the end, was entirely real, and I've held on to that truth carefully, even through everything else. Robert died on a Tuesday morning in February, quietly, in his sleep, which the doctors told me was about as gentle an ending as that particular disease ever offers anyone. I was the one who found him. I want to tell you that grief announces itself in some dramatic way, but mostly what I remember from that morning is how ordinary everything else in the house looked while my entire life had just fundamentally changed shape. The coffee maker was still on its timer. His reading glasses were still on the nightstand, exactly where he always left them. It took me 11 days to figure out how to turn the coffee maker's timer off, because doing it felt, somehow, like admitting he wasn't coming back to drink from it. It was in the 2 years that followed that I sold first the cabin, then eventually the duplex, and it was in those same 2 years that Rachel began, gently and then more insistently, suggesting I move in with her family. I want to be honest that I resisted the idea for longer than I've mentioned so far. Part of me worried about losing my independence at 70. About becoming a burden, about the particular vulnerability of living under someone else's roof after 60 years of managing my own. But loneliness has a way of wearing down even well-founded hesitations, and by the time I said yes, it wasn't really the money or the convenience that convinced me. It was 2 small boys who ran to hug my legs every single time I visited, and a quiet ache in my chest at the idea of missing their childhoods the way I'd already missed too much of my own husband's final years, to the particular cruelty of a failing heart. It was early June, then, several months after I'd settled into that garage suite, when Mark's mother started coming up more often in conversation. Her name was Diane. She lived about half an hour away in a small rental, and I'd only ever met her a handful of times, mostly at family gatherings where she talked at length about herself and rarely asked a question in return. There was a particular kind of woman I'd met a few times in my life, the kind who could turn any room's conversation back toward her own troubles within about 90 seconds, and Diane fit that mold almost perfectly. Rachel mentioned that Diane had been let go from her job managing a retail store, blamed it on corporate downsizing, and I offered the sympathy that situation deserves. I didn't think much more of it at the time. I had my own life by then, my Wednesday book club, my mornings walking the boys to school, my new routine finally starting to feel like mine rather than something borrowed. Looking back now, I can point to small things that summer that should have told me something was off, little details I brushed past because I wanted so badly for the arrangement to be working. Rachel got quieter whenever her phone buzzed at certain hours. She started taking calls out on the back porch instead of in the kitchen, where she usually did everything from paying bills to planning meals. Once, in July, I asked her offhand how Diane was holding up, and she answered too quickly, too smoothly, the way people answer when they've already rehearsed the response in their head. I noticed all of it. I filed none of it away as anything more than a daughter being a good daughter-in-law, helping her husband's mother through a rough patch. I wanted to believe the simplest version of things, and for a while, that's exactly what I did. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know for another 4 months, was that sometime that summer my daughter had made a decision that would upend everything I thought I understood about her. She had taken my debit card, the one I'd given her strictly for emergencies, back when I first moved in, and worried about being stranded without transportation if something went wrong while the boys were at school and Mark was on a job site an hour away. That card was meant for exactly one purpose. Instead, she had quietly handed it over to Diane, and from what I would later piece together, she had done it with barely a second thought. I found out by pure accident the way most people stumble onto the truths that matter most. I'd come up from the garage suite one evening to grab a mixing bowl I'd loaned Rachel for a lasagna I was making, and the kitchen door was open just enough for her voice to carry clearly down the hall. She had no idea I was home. My book club had ended early that night because the host's basement flooded, and nobody had thought to mention the change to her. "Just take it," she was saying into the phone. "Use whatever you need. She's got more than enough sitting in that account. She won't even notice." A pause, then a small laugh, the same laugh she'd had as a little girl, that used to make me laugh right along with her, without even knowing what was funny. Seriously, Diane, stop feeling weird about it. It's fine. She barely even checks that account anymore. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. I didn't storm in. I didn't demand an explanation on the spot, though every part of me wanted to. I went back down to the garage suite, set the mixing bowl on the counter without really seeing it, sat at my little table, and stared at the wall for the better part of an hour, turning the conversation over and over, trying to find some version of what I'd heard that didn't mean what I already knew, somewhere underneath the shock that it meant. I didn't sleep well that night, or really any night for the following week. I went through the motions during the day, packed lunches, walked the boys to the corner where the crossing guard waited, smiled through book club, and each night I lay awake running through every possible innocent explanation. Maybe it was a one-time thing. Maybe Diane had paid her back already, and I simply hadn't noticed a deposit. Maybe I'd misheard something in that hallway, some detail that would make the whole thing collapse into a misunderstanding if I just asked the right question the right way. I wanted an innocent explanation so badly that I nearly talked myself out of checking it all. But I didn't grow up the kind of woman who looks away from an uncomfortable question just because the answer might hurt. My own mother used to say that the truth doesn't get kinder the longer you avoid it. It just gets more expensive. So the following Monday, once the house had emptied out for the day, I sat down at the little desk in my suite and called my credit union. The representative was patient with me, the way people learn to be with callers my age who ask a lot of careful questions and want everything explained twice. She read the transaction history aloud, line by line, while I wrote each one down on a legal pad, because I've never fully trusted myself to remember numbers correctly when my hands are shaking. A grocery store I didn't recognize, 30-some minutes from Rachel's house, in the same town where Diane lived. A pharmacy charge, a utility payment, a phone bill under a name that turned out to be Diane's provider. Small amounts at first, growing steadier as the months went on. Over 4 months, the total came to just over $8,000. $8,000 wasn't going to ruin me, not at my age, not with what I still had set aside in that CD Rachel couldn't touch. But it wasn't nothing, and if I'm honest, it was never really about the number at all. It was that my own daughter had made that choice for me, quietly, in my own home, using words like, "she won't even notice," and "more than enough," as though my savings, everything Robert and I had built across 44 years of early mornings and late shifts, were simply hers to distribute as she pleased, without so much as a conversation. I didn't confront her right away. I drove to the branch myself and had them print the full statement, every transaction, every date, because I wanted to see it laid out in black and white before I said a single word to anyone, even myself. And the longer I studied that printout at my kitchenette table, the more a second question started forming underneath the first, quieter but somehow more unsettling. Why did Diane need that much help, that consistently, for that long? A layoff explains a rough month, maybe 2, while someone gets back on their feet. It doesn't explain 4 straight months of withdrawals that looked less like emergency relief and more like a routine, a pattern, something scheduled rather than desperate. Before I made any calls at all, I spent an entire weekend simply sitting with the printed statement, laying each transaction out on my kitchenette table like pieces of a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted solved. I circled the dates in pencil, noting which fell near the beginning of the month, which fell near the end, trying to see if there was a pattern to when Diane needed the money most. What I found unsettled me in a way the total dollar amount alone hadn't. The withdrawals clustered heavily around the 15th and the last day of each month, the same days most rent payments and utility bills tend to come due. This wasn't someone dipping into extra help during an occasional rough patch. This was someone structuring an entire portion of her monthly survival around access to an account that wasn't hers, that she likely didn't even know belonged to me specifically rather than to Rachel. That realization sat heavy with me for days. I found myself, more than once, standing at the kitchen window in the garage suite, watching Rachel move through her evening routine below, wondering how long this arrangement might have continued if I hadn't happened to come home early from a canceled book club meeting. Would it have been another year? 2? Would the number have simply kept climbing quietly in the background of my life while I remained entirely unaware, trusting the daughter I'd raised to handle my finances with the same care I'd always shown handling hers? I also spent considerable time during that stretch reflecting on my own culpability in the situation, if culpability is even the right word. Had I made myself too easy to take advantage of by handing over that card so freely in the first place, by not checking my own statements more regularly the way a more careful person might have? I went back and forth on this more than I expected to. Robert used to tell me I trusted people too readily, took them at their word before they'd fully earned it, and I wondered, sitting in that suite, whether this was simply the natural consequence of a lifetime spent extending trust generously and rarely being burned badly enough to learn otherwise. I decided, eventually, that while I could certainly be more careful going forward, the fault here belonged squarely with the choice Rachel had made, not with any reasonable trust I'd extended to my own daughter. Parents are supposed to be able to trust their children with access meant for genuine emergencies. That trust being violated wasn't a failure of my judgment, it was a failure of hers. So I made a call I'm not entirely proud of, but don't regret either. An old friend from my book club, a woman named Patricia, had a niece who'd worked at the same retail store as Diane, 2 towns over. I asked Patricia, as casually as I could manage over coffee one Wednesday, whether her niece had ever mentioned anything about the layoffs there. The story that came back to me, secondhand through Patricia a few days later, didn't match anything Rachel had told me. Diane hadn't been part of any corporate downsizing at all. She'd been quietly asked to resign after inventory and cash drawer discrepancies kept turning up under her management. Discrepancies the company chose to handle privately rather than pursue further, mostly because nobody wanted the mess and expense of proving it in court, and because Diane had worked there long enough that management preferred a quiet exit to a public one. I sat with that information for several days before saying anything to Rachel. Days of watching her make dinner, help the boys with their homework at the kitchen table, kiss Mark goodbye each morning before he left for whatever job site was keeping him busy that week, all while I carried the full weight of what I now knew, and she had no idea I knew it. I've never believed in confronting people out of raw anger, no matter how justified that anger might feel in the moment. My own mother used to say that anger makes cheap decisions, and cheap decisions cost the most in the end, more than you ever expect when you're standing in the middle of the fury itself. So I waited. I waited until I had something more useful than fury sitting in my chest. I waited until I had an actual plan. During those days of waiting, I also found myself reflecting on my own history, on the choices Robert and I had made that led to that money existing in the first place. I thought about the year we almost lost the duplex, back when Rachel was 12 and the transmission went out on both our cars in the same month, and how we'd eaten rice and beans for 6 weeks straight, and never once told her how close things had come to falling apart. I thought about how I'd sat up nights doing other families' taxes, on the side, off the books, just to cover the gap, and how none of that sacrifice had ever been visible to Rachel, because we'd made sure of that on purpose. Maybe, I thought, that was part of the problem. Maybe she had no real sense of what that money had cost to accumulate, because we'd shielded her so thoroughly from ever seeing the cost ourselves. Before I brought any of this to Rachel, though, I did something else, something I haven't mentioned yet. I spent an evening going back through old boxes I'd kept from Rachel and Mark's early marriage, boxes I'd helped them pack when they downsized apartments 8 years earlier and had somehow ended up storing in my own closet ever since, the way parents accumulate their children's discarded belongings without ever quite meaning to. In one of those boxes, I found a folder of old bank statements from their first 2 years of marriage. statements Rachel must have printed and never properly disposed of. What I found there surprised me, and in some ways it explained more than the recent statements from my own account ever could. In those early years, before Mark's construction management salary had climbed to where it eventually sat, Rachel and Mark had struggled considerably more than either of them ever let on to me or Robert. There were overdraft fees, more than a few of them, clustered in certain months. There was a period, right after their first son was born, when it looked like they'd nearly missed a mortgage payment themselves, saved only by what appeared to be a loan from Mark's own mother, from Diane, the very woman who would later become the center of everything that unraveled between Rachel and me. I sat with that folder for a long time that evening, turning it over in my mind, and something in me softened slightly, even as the rest of me stayed firm in what I knew I still needed to say to my daughter. It occurred to me, sitting there, that Rachel might have been operating from a debt she felt to Diane that predated anything I understood, a debt from those early lean years when Diane had apparently helped keep their household afloat during a stretch neither of them had ever mentioned to Robert or me. That didn't excuse what Rachel had done with my card, not even slightly, but it did complicate the picture in a way I hadn't expected. People rarely make the choices they make in isolation from everything that came before. Rachel wasn't simply careless with my trust. She was, I began to suspect, working out some old and unspoken obligation using a resource that happened to be mine instead of hers, because her own resources, even now, weren't quite what Diane's ongoing needs required. I called Patricia again that week, the same friend from book club whose niece had worked with Diane, and asked, as delicately as I could, whether she knew anything about Diane's financial history further back, before the store job even. What came back, through that same second-hand channel, painted a picture of a woman who had been quietly struggling for years, not just months, cycling through jobs, occasionally leaning on Mark and Rachel in ways that had apparently started well before I ever moved in smaller amounts I'd simply never had visibility into because it wasn't my account being used yet. This new information didn't change what I intended to do. If anything, it clarified it. Whatever history existed between Rachel, Mark, and Diane, whatever debts of gratitude or obligation had built up over the years before I came to live above that garage, none of it gave my daughter the right to unilaterally decide that my money that represented Robert's entire working life and mine, should be folded into that same ongoing arrangement without so much as a conversation. If anything, understanding the fuller context made me more determined to have this conversation properly, not as an accusation born of a single overheard phone call, but as a real reckoning with a pattern that had apparently been building for years and had simply, finally, reached into my own account because it was the most convenient place left to reach. I also, during those days of preparation, thought hard about what outcome I actually wanted from confronting Rachel. I didn't want to punish her in some permanent way. I didn't want to blow up the arrangement we'd built, the mornings with my grandsons, the fragile but real closeness we'd rebuilt since Robert's death. But I also knew that if I let this pass without real consequence, without real change, it would happen again, in some form, whether with Diane or with something else entirely, because the underlying pattern, using my resources without my knowledge because asking felt harder than simply taking, would remain untouched and unaddressed. I needed consequences that protected my future without severing the relationship I still, despite everything, wanted to preserve. One Sunday evening, after the boys were asleep and Mark had gone down to the basement to watch a game, the sound of the crowd drifting faintly up through the floorboards, I asked Rachel to sit with me at the kitchen table. I brought the printed statement with me, folded in thirds, and set it in front of her without a word. I watched her expression shift in real time, the particular look of someone realizing the ground beneath them has quietly given way without any warning at all. She didn't try to deny it, not even for a second, and I've thought about that a great deal since. She said Diane had been struggling badly, worse than any of us realized. that she felt awful watching her husband's mother go without basic things, groceries, medication, the phone bill that kept nearly getting cut off. She said she knew using my card without asking was wrong, that she'd known it every single time she did it, but she was afraid I'd say no if she asked directly, and she didn't want to have that particular fight, so she avoided the conversation altogether and told herself, again and again, that she'd explain everything eventually, once things had settled down for Diane, once there was a natural moment to bring it up gently instead of as a confession. I asked her, calmly, keeping my voice level in a way that took every bit of discipline I had left, whether she knew the real reason Diane had lost her job. She said no, she'd taken Diane's explanation at face value, the way you do with family, the way you want to. I told her what I'd learned. I watched that piece of information land on her slowly, the way a stone sinks through still water, the ripple spreading out across her face, long after the stone itself had already disappeared beneath the surface. I told her, and I meant every word of it, that I understood the impulse to help family. I told her I understood watching someone struggle and wanting desperately to fix it, to make the discomfort stop for someone you care about. What I could not accept, what I would not simply absorb and move past, was that she had made that decision using money that belonged to me, without asking, without even telling me afterward, and had handed it to a woman with a documented history of taking things that weren't hers. I told her that trust, once spent without permission, doesn't refill itself simply because someone eventually says they're sorry. Sorry is a beginning. It was never going to be the whole repair. The weeks after that conversation were quiet, in a way that was harder, in some respects, than shouting would have been. Dinners where nobody quite met anyone else's eyes across the table. The boys picked up on the tension in that particular way children do, asking why Grandma seemed sad, why Mom and Dad kept having quiet conversations that stopped the moment anyone walked into the room. Mark, once he learned the truth, was angrier than I expected, not just about the money itself, but about being kept entirely out of the loop for 4 months, about his own mother sitting at the center of something his wife had hidden from him, with what must have taken real, sustained effort. There was a particular evening, about 2 weeks after that first conversation, when Mark drove out to see his mother directly, without Rachel, and came back looking like a man who'd aged 5 years over the course of an afternoon. He never told me exactly what was said between them in full, and I never asked, because some conversations belong entirely to the people who have them. But he did tell me, a few days later, sitting alone with me at the kitchen table while the boys watched television in the next room, that he'd finally confronted his mother about the older loan too, the one from those early lean years I'd stumbled onto in that box of forgotten statements. He said Diane had gotten defensive at first, the way people often do when a long-buried arrangement finally gets dragged into daylight, insisting she'd never meant to create some permanent obligation, that she'd only ever wanted to help her son and his young family the way any mother would. Mark told her, calmly but firmly from what I gathered, that helping family didn't come with an unspoken lifetime invoice, and that whatever debt Rachel had felt she owed, real or imagined, it didn't belong to me, and it was never hers to settle using my money without my knowledge. He said Diane cried during that conversation, and that he'd felt terrible about it even while knowing he needed to say what he said. I understood that feeling more than he probably realized. Loving someone and holding them accountable for real harm aren't opposites, but learning to do both at once, in the same breath, is one of the harder skills adulthood asks of us, and watching my son-in-law learn it in real time, on my behalf, was its own strange kind of comfort during an otherwise difficult stretch. Something shifted in Mark after that visit. He started keeping a more careful eye on Diane's finances himself going forward, quietly, the way responsible adult children sometimes have to when a parent has shown, through repeated pattern rather than a single mistake, that they can't be fully trusted with generosity extended to them without some structure around it. He set up a modest, fixed monthly arrangement instead, an amount Diane could count on, transparent to both him and Rachel, specifically so that nobody would ever again feel the particular desperate pressure that apparently leads people toward quiet, unauthorized solutions. I respected him a great deal for handling it that way, for turning what could have become an ongoing family wound into something structured and survivable instead. I want to walk through, a little more slowly than I have so far, what the months following that first conversation with Rachel actually looked like, because the recovery of trust rarely happens in one dramatic scene, no matter how tidy that might make for a story. It happens in dozens of small, almost boring moments, stacked one on top of another, until one day you notice the weight of what came before has actually lifted, even though you couldn't point to the exact moment it happened. The first month after the confrontation was the hardest. Rachel and I were polite with each other in a way that felt worse, honestly, than the silence that preceded it. She'd ask how I was sleeping. I'd say fine. I'd ask about her day. She'd say it was fine. We were both performing a kind of normalcy for the boys' sake, and for Mark's, and I think, if I'm honest, for our own sake too, because neither of us knew yet how to have the harder version of that conversation that still needed to happen underneath the pleasantries. It was actually my younger grandson, the 7-year-old, who cracked something open between us, entirely by accident, the way children so often do. He'd overheard some fragment of tension one evening, not the specifics, just the general strain in the air, and he asked me directly, with the blunt honesty only a 7-year-old can manage, whether Mommy and I were having a fight. I told him grown-ups sometimes need time to work things out, the way he and his brother sometimes needed time after an argument over a video game. He considered that for a moment and then said, with total seriousness, that Grandpa always used to say sorry fixes things faster if you say it before bed instead of waiting. I hadn't told him that. Robert must have said it to him once, some small piece of wisdom passed down before he died, and hearing it repeated back to me by our grandson, in Robert's own rhythm of speech almost, undid something in me that I'd been holding tightly closed for weeks. I brought that moment to Rachel that same night, told her what her son had said, and something in both of us finally broke open properly, past the careful politeness we'd been maintaining. We cried together at that kitchen table, both of us, for the first time since Robert's funeral, and it wasn't really about the money anymore in that moment, or even about Diane. It was about two people who loved each other, trying to find their way back to trusting each other again, after something real had cracked between them, and finally admitting, out loud, how frightened we both were that we might not fully manage it. From there, the second month looked different. Rachel started a habit I hadn't asked for and didn't expect, a small notebook she kept in the kitchen drawer, where she wrote down anything she borrowed from me, no matter how small, a cup of flour, the good scissors, my card for a grocery run she'd cleared with me beforehand. I told her she didn't need to go that far, that I trusted the general shape of things even if the specific trust around money needed more time. She kept doing it anyway, for months, longer than I expected, and I came to understand it wasn't really for my benefit at all. It was for hers. She needed a physical, visible way to prove to herself, as much as to me, that she'd changed how she operated, that the old pattern of quietly deciding things on my behalf was genuinely behind her, rather than simply suppressed under watchful eyes. She also, in that second month, started the counseling I mentioned earlier, on her own initiative, without Mark or me suggesting it first. She told me, a few sessions in, that she was starting to understand her own relationship with Diane differently, recognizing a pattern of feeling responsible for fixing Diane's problems that stretched back to the early years of her marriage, the years I'd only recently learned about myself through that box of old statements. She said the counselor had helped her see that rescuing Diane, over and over, wasn't really generosity in the healthiest sense. It was a way of avoiding a harder, more direct conversation with her mother-in-law about boundaries, a conversation she'd apparently been avoiding for years by quietly solving problems instead of naming them. By the third and fourth months, our rhythm together had genuinely started to feel steadier, not identical to before, because I don't think it ever fully returns to identical, but steadier in its own new way. I began noticing small, unprompted gestures that told me something had actually shifted rather than just settled into a temporary truce. She started asking my opinion on decisions she wouldn't have consulted me on before, not out of obligation, but seemingly because she wanted it. She apologized again, unprompted, on the 6-month anniversary of that hallway conversation, not because I'd brought it up, but because she said she'd been thinking about it and wanted me to know the weight of it hadn't faded for her either. I made a few decisions of my own during that stretch, decisions I'd been circling for a while without quite admitting it to myself. I moved what remained of my savings into an account Rachel had no access to whatsoever, not even in theory, not even for emergencies, a lesson learned the hard way. I asked Mark, of all people, to help me look at a small independent apartment closer to the boys' school, not because I wanted to leave the family entirely, not because I'd stopped loving any of them, but because I needed to prove something to myself. That staying in that garage suite going forward meant actively rebuilding something real between my daughter and me, brick by brick, rather than simply pretending the last 4 months hadn't happened and sliding back into the same unquestioning trust that had gotten us here in the first place. It was at the older boy's 11th birthday party, held in Rachel and Mark's backyard on a warm Saturday in early autumn, a few months after everything had come out into the open, that I finally crossed paths with Diane again. Diane had been invited because she was still the boy's grandmother regardless of anything else, and family gatherings, especially ones centered on children, have a way of forcing people into the same physical space, whether they've resolved their differences or not. I saw her arrive from across the yard, carrying a wrapped gift and wearing the same slightly performative smile I remembered from previous encounters, and I felt my whole body tense in a way I hadn't fully anticipated. I hadn't planned to say anything to her directly. My business, as far as I'd decided, was with my daughter, not with Diane, who owed me nothing in the way of explanation, since she'd never claimed any relationship with me built on trust in the first place. But Diane approached me herself, about an hour into the party, while I was refilling a bowl of chips at the folding table set up near the porch. She said my name, and then, after a pause that told me she'd rehearsed this moment at least a little, she said she wanted me to know she was sorry for the position she'd put me in, that she never should have accepted what Rachel offered without asking more questions about where it was coming from. It wasn't a full accounting of everything, and she didn't mention the job she'd lost or the reasons behind it, and I noticed that omission clearly even as I stood there listening, but it was something, more than the complete silence I'd expected from her, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, accepting it with more grace than I might have predicted a few months earlier. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that I appreciated her saying so, and that I hoped whatever she was going through, she'd find a way to handle it going forward that didn't run through other people's accounts without their knowledge. She nodded, said something vague about starting fresh, and the conversation ended there, both of us retreating back into the safer distance of a crowded party. It wasn't reconciliation, not really. But it also wasn't nothing, and I've come to believe that most of the repair in situations like this happens in exactly that kind of incomplete, imperfect middle ground, rather than in some clean, satisfying resolution where everyone says exactly the right thing. I learned, a few weeks after that party, that Diane had decided to move to be near her sister 2 states away. A decision Mark told me had been building for a while, independent of everything that had happened with me, though I suspect the strain of that year didn't make staying any easier for her either. Rachel drove her to the airport the day she left, and came home quieter than usual that evening, and I didn't push her to talk about it, because some grief, even grief over a complicated relationship, needs room to exist without being immediately explained. Diane never reached out to apologize beyond that one conversation at the birthday party, not with any real specificity about the fuller picture, not with any acknowledgement of the job she'd lost, or the pattern that stretched back further than the 4 months I'd traced through my bank statement. I heard, eventually, through Rachel, that she'd moved out of state to stay with a sister in another part of the country. A fresh start of some kind, though I have my doubts about how fresh any start can be for someone who hasn't reckoned honestly with what led them there. I don't know if she ever fully understood what that money cost beyond the dollar amount printed on my statement, and at this point in my life, I've made a kind of peace with never finding out. Some people never do arrive at that understanding, no matter how much time passes, and chasing an apology that isn't coming is its own way of staying stuck. I ultimately decided against moving into that apartment in the end, though I looked at 3 different units with Mark over the course of about a month. What changed my mind wasn't any single dramatic moment, but a slow accumulation of small ones. Rachel started asking me before she used anything of mine, even something as small as borrowing a serving dish for a dinner party. She started including me more deliberately in family decisions, not out of obligation, but in a way that felt like genuine effort. She sat me down one evening, unprompted, and told me she'd started seeing a counselor on her own, partly to work through why she'd made the choice she made in the first place, why helping Diane had felt, in the moment, more urgent than respecting a boundary with her own mother. I don't know that I fully understand her answer even now, but I respected that she was asking the question of herself at all. Nearly a year on from that evening in the hallway, Rachel and I are speaking again in a way that actually means something, not the careful, polished surface conversations families sometimes use to paper over what's cracked underneath. She apologized properly, more than once, in more than one way, through actions as much as through words, and more importantly, she changed how she operates day to day. She asks now, about everything, even the smallest things, borrowing a cup of sugar, using the good scissors, taking the car for an oil change, in a way that used to almost embarrass me with its thoroughness, and that I've come, slowly, to genuinely value rather than merely tolerate. I still live above that garage. I never did move into that little apartment we looked at, though I keep the listings Mark printed out for me in a drawer, a reminder of a road I chose not to take, and am glad, most days, that I didn't. The boys still come pounding down the stairs every morning to say goodbye before the bus arrives, backpacks half-zipped, shoes on the wrong feet more often than either of their parents would like. On the mornings when the younger one grabs his lunch off the counter without being reminded, and the older one asks me to check his homework one more time before he leaves, I remember exactly why I said yes to moving in the first place, all those months ago, before I knew any of what was coming. And I remind myself, on the harder days, when old resentment tries to creep back in around the edges, that people who fail you can still be worth keeping close, provided they're willing to earn that trust back, honestly, deliberately, one small asked-for decision at a time, rather than expecting forgiveness to simply arrive on its own schedule because enough time has quietly passed. That's the part I try hardest to hold on to now, not the $8,000, not the 4 months of silence, not even the particular sound of my daughter's voice through that cracked kitchen door. What I hold on to is the slower, harder work that came after, the version of my family we've been rebuilding since, one honest conversation at a time, because in the end, that rebuilding is worth infinitely more than any amount sitting in an account ever could be. I think often, especially now, about what Robert would have made of all this, had he lived to see it. He wasn't a man who believed in grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. He believed, mostly, in showing up the next day and doing the next right thing, over and over, until the doing of it became its own kind of proof. I think he would have been angry at first, the way I was, angry on my behalf in that particular fierce way he reserved for anyone he felt had wronged the people he loved. But I also think he would have found his way, eventually, to exactly where I've found my way, toward believing that our daughter was worth the difficult work of repair, rather than the easier path of simply walking away or holding the grievance forever at arm's length. I've thought a great deal, too, about what I would say to another parent standing where I stood that evening in the hallway, having just overheard something that changes how you see your own child. I don't have a tidy piece of advice that applies cleanly to every situation, because every family carries its own particular history, its own old debts and old silences that shape how these things unfold. But I do believe, more firmly now than I did before any of this happened, in the value of slowing down before reacting, in gathering the full picture before deciding what any single moment actually means. Had I confronted Rachel in that hallway, in the heat of what I'd just overheard, I don't know that we'd have found our way to where we are now. The waiting, the printed statements, the quiet research into Diane's history, all of it gave me something sturdier to stand on than raw hurt alone. And I think that sturdier ground is part of why the repair that followed actually held. I also believe, and I say this carefully because I know not everyone will agree, that money given freely between family members should never come without honest conversation, no matter how uncomfortable that conversation feels in the moment. Rachel's instinct to avoid asking me directly, to simply take rather than risk hearing no, wasn't really about the money at all in the end. It was about a fear of conflict, a fear she'd apparently been carrying since childhood, watching Robert and me shield her from every hard financial conversation we ever had. In trying to protect her from difficulty, we may have inadvertently taught her that difficulty itself was something to be avoided rather than moved through directly, and I wonder now whether a little more honesty on our part, all those years ago, might have spared all three of us this particular year of pain. The boys, for their part, have no real memory of any of this being difficult. To them, it's simply the year Grandma got a little quieter for a while, and then wasn't quiet anymore. Children have a mercy about them that adults mostly lose somewhere along the way, a capacity to move forward without carrying every old wound forward with them. I envy that in them, some days, even as I recognize that my own more careful, more scarred way of moving through the world is what allowed me to protect what mattered most in this particular situation. Rachel and I talked, just last month, about the possibility of buying another small property together someday. Something modest, an investment the way the duplex had been for Robert and me all those years ago. Something we could build slowly and honestly, together this time, with full transparency from the very beginning, rather than the kind of unspoken arrangement that nearly cost us everything. I don't know if it will happen. These things take time, and trust, even rebuilt trust, moves at its own unhurried pace. But the fact that we can even imagine building something together again, after everything, feels like its own quiet victory, one I wasn't at all certain we'd reach on that first difficult night at the kitchen table. We hosted Thanksgiving this past year, the first time I'd hosted anything since Robert died, in the small dining space attached to my suite above the garage, a table too small by half for everyone who came, extra chairs pulled in from the main house, plates balanced on knees for the two youngest cousins who didn't mind at all. Kevin flew in with his family. Rachel and Mark brought the turkey, since my suite's oven was too small to manage a bird that size, and the whole thing had the slightly chaotic, overcrowded feeling that I've come to believe is the actual sign of a family working properly, rather than the smooth, photograph-ready version people sometimes imagine when they picture a holiday gathering. At one point during that dinner, Rachel stood up, a little awkwardly, glass of sparkling cider in hand, since none of us drink much anymore, and said she wanted to say something before we all dug in. She talked about the year we'd had, not in specific detail, the boys were listening after all, but in general terms, about learning what it meant to ask instead of assume, about how grateful she was that I'd stayed, that I hadn't simply walked away when I had every reasonable right to. She looked at me directly when she said that last part, and I felt something settle fully in my chest that had been unsettled, in one way or another, for the better part of a year. I said something back, something short, because I've never been much for long speeches even now, sitting here telling you this entire long story. I told them all that the measure of a family isn't whether hard things happen inside it, because hard things happen inside every family, eventually, in one form or another. The measure is what a family does after the hard thing, whether it moves toward each other or away, whether it chooses the harder, slower work of repair over the easier, faster relief of walking away entirely. I told them I was proud of the family we'd chosen to become in the aftermath of what had broken. Prouder, in some ways, than I might have been of a family that had never been tested at all. The older boy, 11 now, rolled his eyes a little at the sentimentality of it, the way 11-year-olds do at almost everything their grandmothers say, and asked if we could please eat before the mashed potatoes got cold. Everyone laughed, and the moment passed the way moments do, folded back into the ordinary business of a holiday dinner. Plates passed, seconds requested, the 7-year-old sneaking extra rolls when he thought no one was watching. But I've held on to that moment carefully since, tucked it away the same way I once tucked away Robert's reading glasses on that nightstand, a small, ordinary thing that turned out to matter more than almost anything else that happened all year. If you're listening to this and you recognize even a piece of your own family in what I've described, I want you to really hear this part, because it's the whole reason I decided to share this story at all. The people we love can hurt us badly, sometimes in ways that feel unforgivable in the moment, and it is entirely possible, at the very same time, for them to still be worth the difficult, patient work of rebuilding what broke. Neither truth cancels the other one out. Holding both of those truths at once, without letting either one erase the other, is the hardest and most important lesson this whole year taught me. Here is what I want you to take with you, more than any single detail of what happened in that hallway or at that kitchen table. Money will come and go, accounts will empty and refill, but trust, once it's spent without permission, doesn't come back on its own. It only comes back through action, through asking instead of assuming, through choosing honesty, even when honesty is harder than staying quiet. If there is one thing worth protecting fiercely in your own family, it isn't the balance in an account. It's the plain, simple habit of asking before you take. That single habit, practiced consistently, is the difference between a family that survives its hardest year and a family that doesn't. That difference, between performing wholeness and actually rebuilding it, made all the difference for us, and I hope, wherever you are in your own version of this story, you find your way to that same difference too. If this story moved you, if any piece of it reminded you of your own family, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and if you want more real stories like this one, honest stories about family, trust, and what it actually takes to rebuild what breaks, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next one.